and there are lots in New York and Boston and Atlanta and other places like that. The second myth that I hear frequently is that all Indians in Florida are Seminoles or were Seminoles. That if you find the presence of whether it's a mound that was built along the coast or even a contemporary reservation, that all Indians in Florida are Seminoles. And right, so we have historically in Tallahassee, of course, you know about the Appalachee, or in Jacksonville, it's the Timucua. Down in Miami, it's the Tequesta. But also in Miami today, or near Miami today, we have the Muskogee Nation, which is another federally recognized tribe. But we also have citizens of the United States who are also citizens of other tribal nations in Florida, and that can include everyone from Comanche, which we heard about earlier, to Cherokee, to Choctaws, to Creeks. And so, right, just to try to break apart the state of Florida and the Seminoles, it goes in both ways. So lots of Seminoles don't live in Florida, and lots of non-Seminoles are Indians who live in Florida. The third myth is even more complicated, but this is one that the Seminole Tribe of Florida insists upon us understanding. And I guess it's number 3 and number 4, and it relates to who the Seminoles are and where they come from. And so the number 3 would be that Seminoles were in Florida in 1492. That's the equivalence of saying that the United States existed in 1492. So the Seminole Tribe of Florida is a federally recognized tribe who have ancestors that go back a very long ways, but as a federally recognized tribe, they're formed actually in the middle of the 20th century. And the term Seminole and the group Seminole emerges somewhere around the 1800s. They're roughly as old as the United States is as a polity, as a government. But at the same time, people frequently say, well, the ancestors are the Seminoles are newcomers. Their ancestors were all Creeks or Choctaws or African Americans. Now, they have Creek ancestors, some. They have Choctaw ancestors, some. They have African American ancestors often. But they also have what we will call ancient Florida ancestors. They have Calusas in their past, they have Tequestas in their past. So when you trace their family tree or their ancestry or their lineage, their origins go back in Florida significantly longer than Europeans did. They would say that they come to Florida basically out of the shell at their origins in the order of their clan, right, back to the time before memory. Archaeologists would say that human beings have been in Florida for at least 14,000 years. And so if we can imagine, right, not all Seminoles have all their ancestry back, but I think we can do that for people around the globe. So as the Seminoles, they form as a people, they coalesce, they create new villages and new towns, they slowly create a new polity. By the 19th century, they are in the way of American slavery, they're in the way of kind of the growth of the Cotton South, and they wage 3 wars of resistance against the United States. Euphemistically, the outsiders call it the First, Second, and Third Seminole Wars. The Seminoles themselves simply consider it one war of attrition, one war of, they often call genocide. Out of this, the Seminoles, we think there are roughly, say, 15,000 Seminoles, somewhere around there at the start of the Second Seminole War. About 4,500 to 5,000 are forcefully removed to Indian territory. Maybe 800 remain in Florida, and the rest are slaughtered. It is a horrific set of wars. At the end of the Third Seminole War in 1858, the United States government estimates that there's roughly 300 to 400 Seminoles left in the state. Which brings me to kind of myths 5, 6, and 7. Number 5, Seminoles frequently call themselves, and outsiders routinely call themselves, and FSU has embraced this idea that the Seminoles are unconquered. I want you to think about those numbers that I just said in terms of what it means to be unconquered. So the vast majority of Seminoles were either forcefully removed from the state or killed. They did not survive the 3 Seminole Wars. Now, for a small group of survivors, they certainly weren't made extinct. But in the beginning, native people in Florida occupied from Tallahassee south. At the end of the First Seminole War, they occupied basically Gainesville south. At the end of the Third Seminole War, they occupied parts of the Everglades in the interior of the Big Cypress Reserve. So I'm not sure I want to call them unconquered, but as a way of selling your tourist sites, as a way of marking one's valor and courage and sacrifice, this becomes a euphemism for those folks in Florida who sacrificed a tremendous amount as to not be removed from their state or killed. The sixth one is that the Seminoles were never removed, or they were the only native group in the American South to kind of resist and successfully resist Indian removal. Well, there's the Eastern Band Cherokee in North Carolina. There's the Alabama Coushatta in Alabama, and there's the Porch Band Creeks in Alabama as well. And there's lots of smaller groups in the American South, the Lumbee, for example, in North Carolina. So other native people were able to resist removal, but more Seminoles were removed than not removed. And Tallahassee is a Seminole word for old fields, because where we are sitting, or at least most of us are sitting, was once Seminole country. It's obviously not that type of Seminole country anymore. So those folks who lived on kind of the Pine Barrens of North Florida and are now their great grandkids or so are living in the wetlands of the interior of Florida, they were forcefully removed. They did not leave on their own choice, if we give the word choice any sort of meaning. Right, from here to where the Atafiki Museum is on the Big Cypress Reservation is about 450 miles. That's a pretty far way to be forced off one's land. So if number 5 is that they're not unconquered, number 6 is that most of them or many of them were removed, or at the very least their lands were severely shrunk. Number 7, lots of people keep telling me the Seminoles never signed a treaty with the United States. And the easiest way to explain that that's simply not true, there's a wonderful story in the 1920s. The Seminoles were participating in Palm Beach in something called Flagler Day. It was during tourist season, and they were hired at a pretty good sum, at least at a time when they were really impoverished, to come and dance what was called the Sundance. It was this kind of pay-per-view performance. And the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from Washington, D.C. was actually going to attend. And he said, I heard that there was a rumor that the Seminoles are still at war with the United States. They can't participate and I won't attend unless they say they're not at war. And within about 20 minutes, the Seminoles came forward and one of their leaders said, that's just a joke. That's what we tell tourists in order for them to come and see what they imagine to be an unconquered people. But 2 other more recent, whether we want to call them treaties or not, agreements with the United States. Most of us know that FSU has an agreement with the Seminole Tribe of Florida that they renew every few years, where the Seminoles have granted permission to Florida State to do so, but they've also granted that permission directly with the state of Florida. So it is signed off by the state government. And the other way that maybe more significantly is that they routinely sign what's known as a compact with the United States and the state of Florida, which is the legal agreement that allows them to open casinos and other forms of gaming on their territory. So on sovereign lands, they can have casinos, but only if it adheres to an agreement with the state, and those agreements are called compacts. Now, those are not peace treaties, but they're certainly the equivalent of treaties. They are signed between leaders of both the state and the federal government. It gets sent up to Washington, D.C., where it's ratified. So that's 5, 6, and 7. Number 8, I've heard this a lot. Seminoles were given gaming or casinos as reparations, that the United States or the state of Florida felt bad for Seminoles, and therefore they are allowed to have casinos as a way of obtaining money in order to support themselves. And nothing can be further from the truth. The Seminoles are at the vanguard of tribal sovereignty, or the fight for tribal sovereignty in the United States. In the 1970s, they realized that 441 or State Road 7 cut right along the eastern border of their reservation, and they were per capita earning about $53 per family. They were impoverished and they were struggling. And they had this idea that if they could drive up to North Carolina, buy cartons of cigarettes where it was significantly cheaper, drive them down to Florida, they can put them in the equivalent of their 7-Eleven, and outsiders driving along would buy them and not have to pay the 5%, the 4% sales tax and the cigarette tax, which was just slowly starting to inch up. And that's how they made money for about 6 months until the sheriff of the town shut it down, and there was a lawsuit, and the Seminoles won. And the logic is that there are 3 forms of sovereignty in the United States. We are all remarkably familiar, I hope, with 2. There is federal sovereignty and there is state sovereignty. And if the state passes a law that is in contradiction to federal law, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides, where does jurisdiction reign? Does it reign at the local state level, or does it reign at the federal level? Because in the Constitution, they are co-equal forms of power. The Constitution also adheres to and kind of acknowledges tribal sovereignty, a third co-equal part. And so in the case of the cigarettes, they were able to argue, the tribe was able to argue that sales tax had never been collected on tribal lands beforehand. And so precedent was set, which allows them to sell certain things on the reservation without outside concern. There are other things that they can't do, which will bring me to number 9. How come Seminoles don't pay taxes or follow federal or state law? The opposite is true. Seminole citizens do pay taxes. They pay taxes the same as any US resident in the United States. They vote, they pay taxes, they follow 3 sets of laws. They follow federal law, they follow state law, and when on reservation, they follow tribal law. And in each case, federal, state, and tribal law provides limitations on one's behavior, but it also provides, say, opportunities for other behavior. But they adhere to all. So citizens pay taxes. But the flip is true. The Seminole Tribe of Florida does not pay taxes. They are a government. And the easiest explanation would be that the state of Florida doesn't pay federal income tax. The state of Alabama does not pay federal income tax. The Seminole Tribe of Florida does not pay federal income tax. They are their own entity, if you will. Number 8, excuse me, we already did 8 and 9. Number 10, and this is one that is probably the most important for me, and this is where I spend a lot of my time with my research, is Seminoles are losing their culture because of financial success or modernity. I was once at the Seminole Museum giving a tour of teachers, and one of the teachers approached the then chairman of the tribe and said something along the lines of this: Mr. Chairman, I just want to apologize on behalf of all white folks around, because if we never came here, I can't imagine how beautiful this place would be, and you'd be able to live your life the way you want to live your life. And the chairman, who apparently had heard this comment before many, many times, who was also very, very funny, he looked at her in the eyes and said, I'm not sure what you're talking about. I'd like to imagine that if you all didn't come here, I'd still be driving my BMW. Right? He had this idea in his head that he and the culture that he inhabited has been changing for thousands of years, and they too would have invented anything that they needed in order to survive or to thrive. So the flip of this is that people often imagine that Seminoles and other Native people once had a pure or original culture, that once upon a time they really lived as Native people, and then slowly that has slipped away from them. Once upon a time they dressed correctly. Once upon a time they told the right stories. Once upon a time their music was, or their food or their housing was more pure. The Seminoles like to say that they are modern by tradition. That they have, since their very origins, have always looked not just to adhere to things that they care about, which they do, but they look to adhere to things that they care about in ways that allow them to live in a modern world. And they balance it perhaps differently than other people, but they still have that balance between modern and tradition in ways that allow them to be both. So I'm going to try to share my screen really, really quickly, if you don't mind, so I can just show you a couple of images which might help. Let's see, how do I do this? All right, so here is a picture that the US military sketched. Is it coming up?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, perfect. I only see myself. So this is an image that a US colonel sketched in 1835 in the midst of the Seminole Wars. And this is what he called Chickies, which is a simple way of saying house in one of the two Seminole languages in Creek, Muskogee Creek. And if you look at the pictures, they have thatched roofs, they have windows, they have walls. Some of them, like if you look kind of center towards the right, some of them look a little bit like log cabins. Some of them don't appear to have walls at all. You can see in the back right-hand corner, there's one that looks like a tent. No walls, just a kind of the two eaves of a house. And then you have others that are lifted off the ground. So in 1835, when the United States is trying to figure out who their enemy is and they sketch what a village looks like, this is what they come up with. In 1879, Richard Pratt, who becomes one of the leading spokesmen and becomes basically the president or principal of a boarding school. A decade later, but 1879, he comes to Florida to do a report of the Seminoles for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this is the house that he sketches. It is made out of lumber. It has a roof. It has the makings of a door. One can imagine a barn door there, or perhaps it was open. But this is not, these are not just saplings of trees lined up, but rather you can tell that this is lumber from this has been milled. We fast forward 10 years later and we go into the interior, and this becomes what's known as the stereotypical or the prototypical Chickee. This is Clay Mccauley. He was a reverend. He worked for the Smithsonian. He came down, wrote a report on the Seminoles, and he said that the one on your right with the raised floor, the open walls, the thatched roof, that is their traditional Chickee. And the one on your bottom right, the one that doesn't have a floor at all, but just the two eaves, that's a temporary Chickee. And if you go back to here, in 1835, we have on your bottom left what almost looks like a Chickee. Right above that, you have something that looks like a hunting house or Chickee, and then you have things that look like log cabins. So Pratt has one version of it. Mccauley sees two others. Over the course of time, the Chickee becomes one of the ways in which the Seminoles sell themselves in terms of their culture to the outside world. And it also becomes something that they embrace as something that is kind of part of who they are. So if you're living in the interior of the wetlands, the materials used to make a Chickee are readily available, and they are also remarkably hardy. I was reading a report yesterday of a hurricane that cut through Florida in the 20s, and the reports out of Palm Beach was that everything was leveled, but 20 miles into the interior, where there was rampant flooding, the Chickies still stood. But the picture on your bottom right is probably my favorite that I have found. And it's a picture of a Chickee from what's now the Brighton Reservation, right to the northwest of Lake Okeechobee. And take a minute to look at it. It's a Chickee. I've asked a few tribal members what would they call it. It's a Chickee because it's a house. And in some ways, it follows the same idea. We have these poles that are holding up a roof. There are no walls. The floors are elevated to allow for rising water or animals or to keep the area a little bit cooler. But there's a corrugated metal roof. They've repurposed all sorts of metal goods that they found. Now, I went to grade school mostly in South Florida, and I couldn't imagine how loud and noisy that would have been in a rainstorm after spending times in a metal roof gymnasium. I think there's a reason why I don't find many photographs of metal roof Chickees. But you can also look in here and you can see that they've tapped into someone's electric line. Look closely to kind of the top third on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see an electric wire cutting across, and then apparently it goes down to a Coca-Cola refrigerator on the bottom. And so for me, this is a nice memory that once upon a time, the Seminoles they didn't know that that was what a Chickee was supposed to look like. But they were experimenting, trying to figure out new ways in order to improve the conditions in which they lived. All right, let me end the screen. Actually, let me show you one other thing really quickly. All right, so just to give you a sense for where they are. So here is the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma. Most of their lands have been disbanded and terminated since then, and they've tried piecing them back together. These are the major Seminole reservations in Florida on your bottom left. This is where they were when Clay Mccauley came. And I'm going to point to this one just for a second as a means of just trying to point to one thing. So this, if you look closely here, your 5 different names. You have Big Cypress, you have the Miami River Settlement, you have Fish Eating Creek, you have Cow Creek and Catfish Lake. They're all about 80 to 120 miles apart from one another. None of them had more than 120 people in them at the time. According to Clay Mccauley, there was a total of maybe 300 people. He counted 208, but later admitted that he may have undercounted. These folks on the very bottom are the Miccosukees today. There was remarkably little communication between these 4 groups on the top and this group on the bottom. So once upon a time, they had the ability to communicate amongst one another on a weekly or monthly basis, but not on a daily basis. But the Miccosukees in South Florida had very little to do with these folks. And that's a large way in which they became kind of 2 separate groups of people in the end. All right, so those are the 10 myths. And the myths permeate the ways in which everyone from our, let's say, our school teachers, when they pick up textbooks, these myths are there. They're certainly in many of the museums, everywhere from the Smithsonian through the National Park Service to local museums. These ideas are everywhere. And I'm hoping that, 1, we can talk a little bit about them, but 2, that as we move forward, we can rethink kind of where Seminoles are in our consciousness. And I guess before I end, I'll say that there are about 4,800 Seminole tribal citizens today in the state of Florida. And there are about another 1,500 residents of the Seminoles who are not full citizens, but who live on reservations or who are children of citizens, but not citizens themselves. All right, so that's those are my 10 myths. I'm hoping that we have some questions. But I can't hear. So I think you have to write them unless people can be unmuted.
You can either raise your hand or I can unmute you, or you can actually post in the chat, or you can post in the Q&A, either one. Anybody have a question? Oh, there's one. From Doug Wyndham.
Oh, great question. So clans are extended family units. Depending on, right, so there's Wind Clan, there is Deer Clan, Big Town Frog. There are at least 8 clans amongst the tribe, Panther being the largest. I say at least 8, they say 8, but there's a movement to split Panther into Panther and Bobcat. They say that once upon a time they were separate, and then as their numbers shrunk, they became the same. But clans are matrilineal extended families. So if your mother is Panther, you are Panther. If you are Panther, you will have a non-Panther spouse. And so in Seminole society, that which is similar to, say, the rest of the American South in terms of Native people, you follow your identity and your tribal affiliation through your mom, your family through your mom. And so clans are at the heart of where you live. Clans are at the heart of where you dance at ceremonies. And that becomes a means of kind of understanding where you fit in the world. So when I teach my class, when I'm not teaching about myth, but I'm teaching about kind of building blocks of community, clan is the most important thing. So that gets me to the question of like, what are clans? The second question on there is like, give me another example of what is traditionally modern. All right, so once upon a time, before the Singer sewing machine, Seminoles wore clothing that looked remarkably similar to what all the portraits, if you've ever seen 1830s portraits of Seminole people, they wore a blend of Scottish clothing because they would buy cloth and bolts from Scottish merchants, but they would put them together in traditional ways. In the 1920s, when they got Singer sewing machines, they started making patchwork. And when the Seminole tribe today has contests for men and women for clothing, they actually have a contemporary modern category. And so they have a historical version and they have a modern version. Both don't look anything the way that non-Seminoles dress, but they look remarkably like what kind of like a modernized version of what they wore in the past. Another modern tradition would be alligator wrestling. Seminoles, hard to imagine, but in 1820, when there weren't audiences there willing to pay them, no one wrestled alligators. By the 1950s, this became one of the ways in which Seminoles in tourist areas made a really significant living. Some of the most affluent and politically powerful men in the community and a few of their women wrestled alligators at various tourist sites. And at the end of the evening, or the end of the show, tourists would throw coins into the water, and the man who was the wrestler would dive in, collect the coins, and get paid. In more recent years, elders talk about that while there are new moves being made, new ways of wrestling with the alligators, but perhaps more importantly, now the Seminoles run a alligator wrestling tournament for non-tribal members as a way of kind of holding on to this tradition. One last modern tradition would be the creation of new clans. So the Seminoles tell a story that once upon a time, all of Earth was in a shell on the top of a mountain, and the master of breath was inside the shell and was circling. And once upon a time, and eventually it cracks open and they come out in the order of their clan, and they list the clan. Everyone says it a little bit differently, but say panther comes out first, then bird, then wind, etc. In the last 100 years, they've added a different clan. Big Town, for example, did not exist until really the 1920s. And they've created new stories in order to talk about how this fits into the ancient origins. And they're really, really apparent about it. Okay, so the next question is, I've always wondered why FSU doesn't have a museum of Seminole history or other special building. I wonder about that too. So that's a great question. So the only thing I can say in FSU's favor, for me at least, is the reason why I'm at FSU is that the tribe insisted that the university have someone who teaches Seminole Indian history. So I was hired in 2005, right, roughly about the same time, a year after this NCA made its ruling. And so the courses that I teach, or at least one of the courses I teach, come directly out of that dispute. But there have been conversations over the years about having Seminoles be more accurately represented on campus. And there are bits and pieces happening at FSU. So if you're paying attention, what our homecoming princess, which is just a ridiculous thing that we have, but our homecoming princess and homecoming chief wear clothing that is now designed by Seminole tribal members. Rather than wearing Siouan headdresses, they wear traditional turbans. But yeah, I think it would be a win for both communities if we ever had a real museum of Seminole history on campus, or even a real exhibit. The next question, do the Seminoles trace back to the earliest archaeological finds in Florida? That is the great $1 million question. Archaeology does a really horrible job of long history related to polities. They can tell how long an area has been occupied sometimes, but they can't tell when a polity begins or doesn't begin. So there are historic sites, archaeological sites in Florida that we can trace from, say, 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, and we can see them being occupied by Native people in the 16, 17, and 1800s by Native people. And we know that those native people who lived there, some of them went into the interior and became part of this group called Seminoles. That's tracing them back, but it's not in the direct way where we can say, here's Fort Center, an old archaeological site in the center of the state. We can't find people who were there who stayed all the way through, even though we have a site that's there that's really old. So I wrote a book 3-4 years ago on a Tequesta site on the Miami River. And so the Tequesta occupied that site on the north bank of the Miami River from about 2,000 years ago until about 1800. And we know some of the Tequesta who were there were not removed to Havana, were not killed by disease, but we can't literally trace them into the interior. We just know they went into the interior, and we can guess that they became part of the Seminole tribe. All right, next question. Man, these are good ones.
I'm going to interrupt you there. Hang on just a second,
Yeah.
Dr. Frank. Mike Sheridan has his hand up, so I'm going to unmute
Oh, go ahead.
him.
Thank you. I can't see all the people at once.
I know there's so many.
It's really two questions. One is very simple. The picture in back of you, obviously the Everglades, whereabouts was that taken?
I don't know. Truthfully, I was looking for a good piece of art because I have a blank wall behind me and I wanted something that was kind of representative.
Good enough.
I can tell you, I'm looking on the website where I got it from. It looks like it's about 10 miles north of the Miskogee Reservation. So pretty far south. I like it. I'm going to scoot over. I like it here because when you find old pictures of villages, they would be along these naturally occurring, they're not quite called rivers, but they're cut-throughs where the water naturally flows and keeps the reeds a little bit lower. But I wish I had a better answer for you on that. What's your second question?
You told me about a site on the Miami River that the Tequestas occupied for thousands of years. What in general was the connectivity between what we knew later as the Seminole tribe and what was left of the Calusas and Tequestas?
All right, so the Calusa were on the west coast and the Tequesta were on the east coast from roughly year zero, like 2,000 years ago, up through the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th and 17th century. And they suffered from a whole series of things, everything from warfare with the Spanish to slave raids by folks from the north to epidemic diseases. And so the Spanish offered them opportunities to fight on their side, offered them ability to hide in missions. And when the Spanish left the missions, they evacuated several hundred Tequesta to Havana and several hundred Calusas to Havana, leaving their villages intact, but largely empty. And so those folks who did not want to go to Havana, those Tequestas on the east or the Calusas on the west, they fled into the interior where they thought they could be safer. And they flee to the interior at roughly the same moment that the Seminole tribe starts to form out of them as newcomers, but also Creeks and other folks from the north coming south to escape colonialism. So, so they're there from the very beginning, if you will. Like most people don't imagine that the Seminoles exist prior to say 1750 or so, but there were people there who later become Seminoles, and some of them are Tequesta and some of them are Calusa.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead. All right, so next question. How is the tribe governed? So the Seminole Tribe of Florida has a written constitution. It was written in 1957, and they have elections democratically, one person, one vote. And it's pretty simple. So they have a chairman and a vice chairman, and then they have representatives on their council, one from each of the three major reservations, one from Hollywood, one from Big Cypress, and one from Brighton. And they are responsible for all sorts of governmental decisions. Their financial affairs are run by a board with similar type of representation, but the chairman of the board is the vice chair of the of one and vice versa in the other way. So they have one board to run their financial affairs and one board basically to do government. And they have their own, let's say, they have their own housing, they have their own police, they have their own fire, they have their own schools, and they adhere to federal, state, and tribal rules. They have their own court system for family court. So they're a fully functioning government with relationships to the governments that surround them. The next question, I hope I got to that, the tribe part. Are there kinship relations between the Muskogee Nation and Escambia, Bruce, Florida, and the Seminole Miccosukee? I don't know. Kinship is a really hard thing to trace, especially in Indian country. Seminoles, and for that matter, the Muskogee Nation, they trace lineage differently than I do. The Seminoles would say parentage matters if it's matrilineal, but it doesn't particularly matter if it's patrilineal. And so I would venture to guess there probably is kinship relations, but how I haven't heard any what I would consider, say, first cousins, but distant kin, it'd be hard to imagine that they don't. All right, next question. What is the process to become a citizen for those who live on reservations but are not registered as part of the Seminole Nation or tribe? Okay, so to be a citizen of the Seminole tribe of Florida, you have to have 1/4 of your lineage. This is because of federal law. 1/4 of your lineage must descend to another Seminole tribal member. And so if you are born to a Seminole citizen who is 1/4, and the other parent is less than 1/4, you can live in your parent's home. You can take advantage of the school that is around the corner, and you're obviously part of the Seminole community, but you're not eligible to vote. You're not eligible for the privileges or some of the privileges of being on reservation. So that's often the case. And so there is frequently a conversation among tribal members as to whether they will change that to make it 1/8 or get rid of it altogether. The former chairman of the tribe, James Billy, he's a grandfather to several kids, some of whom are citizens and some of whom are not, right? And because of that, he was pretty public about the possibility of the pros and the cons of what that means if it would expand what that would be. Are there foods unique to Seminole tradition? Yes. So unique, not unique. There's certainly foods that Seminoles have traditionally eaten or historically have eaten. Some of them are close to foods that other Native people ate. So there's a thing called sofkey that Seminoles still eat, but they ate routinely, say 100 years ago, which is kind of like cornmeal and some sort of ash or potato, a soda, baking soda, and it's stirred in a really large pot, unsalted with a little bit of grease, and it puffs up. And that's what they would eat basically from morning until evening. And then they would have a big, what we would call dinner. But that was kind of somewhere between drink and, because you don't quite chew it, really like almost like a thick stew, but it's like thinned out grits. They traditionally have eaten kunti, which is but non-Seminoles eat that too, but as a food that they ate as a staple crop. Kunti is a zamia plant that grows across most of Florida. You dig it out, the root is poisonous, but if you scrape it and you strain it a bunch of times, you can make a flour out of it. You can buy it now at Whole Foods because it's apparently gluten-free. But those are two of the foods that are really unique. Maybe not that they're the only ones who eat it, but they're certainly two of the foods that they eat in much more quantity in a way that is really important to them, that moves beyond food but into culture. Next question is, see, I have found arrowheads in my parents' field near the Junior Museum in Tallahassee. Can I claim these as Seminole arrowheads? Does FSU pay the Seminole Nation any amount of money to use their image? The second question is easier than the first. No, FSU doesn't pay the Seminole tribe anything. If anything, the tribe provides resources the other way. But there's no financial arrangement between the two. Every once in a while, the Seminole tribe asks for expertise in something. And to my knowledge, FSU has never forced a faculty member to provide that expertise. But I know that some of us will provide it in part because we're at FSU and in part because we think it's a good thing to do. But they've gotten assistance from the Department of Ed, the College of Nursing, and the History Department over the years. As for the arrowheads, there's no way for me to tell you whether the arrowheads belong to any particular tribe or not. You have to date them. They could be Creek. They could be all sorts of things. But if you want to call them Seminole, nothing's to stop you from calling them Seminole. But I'm not sure what's to be gained. Over the course of my teaching, I've had lots of students who either hunt or hike or fish, and they come to my class with arrowheads. They're really, really plentiful. So unless it's really like incredibly old and it goes to kind of Paleo Indian times of several thousand years ago, 8,000 to 20,000 years ago, they're just really plentiful. So there's a question about the connection between artifacts from the Gulf Coast and the Mayans. Do I think historically that they traded together? It's an interesting question. So there's two trains of thought. There's a lot of folks out there that see similarities between how the Mayans, certain artistic renditions of things, and the ways in which Seminoles, or Calusas before that, did things. And therefore they say, well, there are two similarities, they must have communicated with one another. Most archaeologists don't see a connection. Most say that there are, just the same way that we can find similar forms of kind of iconography across the world, doesn't mean that they spoke with one another. I don't know enough about it. I just know that there are no oral traditions that I know of that talk about this in the same way. The Seminoles, when they tell their story, and the Creeks, when they tell their story, they either come out of Florida or they come back. They talk about coming from the west, not across water. And if they're going to come from Mexico, there's very little in the way that we can say that they would come up out of Mexico into Texas and come across the Gulf on land. All right, next question. Do we know how many survived the Trail of Tears? Where are they located in Oklahoma? Do they have reunions or gatherings in Florida yearly? So we know at least 4,000 survived the Trail of Tears. They're located primarily in northwestern Oklahoma. Once upon a time, they had reservation lands. In the 1950s, the reservation lands were taken away from them. Now they have campgrounds and tribal lands, but technically they're not reservations, although they're putting them back together. They do not have reunions and gatherings in Florida yearly, although they have formal communication with one another. And I've heard lots of stories of Seminoles either going out to Oklahoma to learn from one another or in reverse. But in terms of reunions or gatherings, there's nothing on a formal way. Another question about the picture behind me. It could be from a PBS cover of Florida. I've seen pictures like this a lot. This is just from the Nature Conservancy, which is, I had it on my website, so I took it. Next question. What is your take on Osceola's mythic knifing of the 1835 treaty? And do you think Osceola will ever be able to come home and be buried in the state of Florida? Osceola never stabbed the treaty, 1835 or otherwise. There's absolutely no evidence for it. We have the treaty, there's no hole. The only eyewitness to it, the earliest source we have was not an eyewitness. It was a couple years after. He said that he heard that Osceola was outside the tent waving a knife. The first discussion of him actually stabbing the treaty isn't for several years later. Had he stabbed the treaty, General Clinch would have used that as proof that the Seminoles were so horrible, and they would have used that as a means to rally the troops to get more funding and more men to subdue the Seminoles. He didn't. And you would have no reason to hide that at all. The second question is more uplifting. Do you think Osceola will ever be able to come home and be buried in the state of Florida? Osceola is buried in the state of Florida. His body from the shoulder down was exhumed many years ago, and the tribe has buried it in a secret location, of whom I don't know if anyone outside of a handful of people know where that is. From the neck up, his body was, his head, excuse me, his skull and the rest of his from the neck up was removed shortly after he died by the doctor who did the autopsy. That I'm less confident about ever being found again. It went missing several generations ago, and there's no leads yet as to where it is, although the Seminole tribe has been looking. Do the Seminoles have a traditional form of craft or artistry that they focus on? So they are, as a whole, expert seamstresses. They are known for their patchwork clothing, skirts, shirts, jackets, and other things. If you want to see some really good examples of it, you can go to, here, I'm going to type it in the Atafiki Museum. They have a website. It's a museum run by the Seminole Tribe of Florida. They have exhibits up there, and they usually have an exhibit about patchwork, but they'll certainly have pictures of contemporaries and non-contemporaries wearing it. But they, elders and women in particular, they still make a tremendous amount of joy in making patchwork for themselves, and sometimes they sell it to outsiders. They used to sell a lot of it to outsiders, significantly less these days. So that would be the best place to go for that. The state of Florida, the Florida History Museum, I haven't been there in a while, and I'm not leaving my house anytime soon. But they have historically had exhibits with patchwork on it as well. And I assume that there's some that's there. It's beautiful. I mean, it's really, really intricate and quite wonderful.
We have a few pieces in our collection, not many, but we have a few pieces in our collection as well. And we have 2 questions in your Q&A box at the bottom.
Oh yeah, I didn't see that one. Sorry about that.
They're everywhere.
So what trees were the poles in the Chickies made out of to resist severe storms? It's a great question. Most likely cypress, but they use normally that which is around them. They tend not to use pine, but that's all I know. I know they use cypress also for their dugout canoes as much as possible. But for those, they have to be cypress that fell generations earlier. They don't like to chop down new cypress. It doesn't work as well, apparently. Do the Seminoles use fire, like prescribed fire burning? They certainly don't anymore. To the best of my knowledge, they did not use prescribed fire. Creeks certainly did in North Florida and in Georgia and Alabama. They used to light fires to kind of get rid of the underbrush in areas where they were going to go hunting because it made it harder for the deer to hide. Less so, they would use, the only time I can see Seminoles using fire in Florida over the last 200 years is they would clear fields by lighting fires to the bottoms of trees, and that would weaken the trunks, and then they can knock them down pretty easily. But they didn't burn entire fields. And I think that's the end of the 2 Q&As. Oh, here we go. Thank you, Tara.
Okay.
Can you shed some light on the historic relationship between Seminoles and Maroons? Okay, so from the moment that Africans are enslaved in the New World, or in North America at least, they look for ways to obtain freedom. And in the 1600s, one of those ways of obtaining freedom was taking flight and coming into Florida. And some of those enslaved people found freedom by establishing communities that we'll call Maroon communities. They were entirely of African descent. They were self-sustaining, and they were largely hidden from the outside world. At the same time that they are forming, Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Tequesta, Ais, all the native peoples of the American South are also looking for ways to obtain kind of space away from the colonial presence. And some of them take flight and move into North and Central Florida, where they meet other native people who are looking for similar ways to survive, and they form separate villages. So we have what we'll call Maroon villages and indigenous villages, often really close to one another. Over the course of time, sometimes these villages are remarkably distinct from one another, where there's no confusion between what is a Maroon and what is Seminole. And then sometimes there are communities where through trade, marriage, friendship, alliances, there's a blurred line between the two of them. So during the Second Seminole War, the United States repeatedly said that they were fighting two different wars. They were fighting a war against runaway slaves and a war against runaway Indians. Right? They used the same language of runaway for both. And tremendous confusion took place. Now, most of the enslaved, or most of the Maroons, the self-emancipated slaves, most of them fled Florida in the 1830s when the United States said, if you stop fighting, we'll let you go to Oklahoma and we won't hunt you down and re-enslave you. And 600 took that offer. Ironically, the offer was given by the same US officer that captured Osceola, to go back to one of the earlier questions beforehand. So the idea of the United States was to divide and conquer, and that was one of the ways in which they did that. Getting deeper than that, there's a lot of really good books. If you want me to point you to some, I'm happy to. But the connection between African Americans and Seminoles is a really complicated and interesting one. All right, so the name of the monograph. So there's I'm having one of those moments. Bear with me 1 second. In Andros Island, it's Rosalind Howard. I'm just blanking on the name of her book. I think it's Black Seminoles in the Bahamas. Yep, that's the name of it. Black Seminoles in the Bahamas by Rosalind Howard. She's a UCF anthropologist. And she traced this community of Maroons from Florida who had connections to the Seminoles. And during the Second Seminole War, they took flight and they didn't go west, but they went to the Bahamas, to Andros Island, where they created a community that is still kind of intact, vibrant, cultural place unto itself. So that's really good. And then there's a couple books by a scholar named Kevin Mulroy. One of them is called Freedom on the Border. But he's really interested a little bit on the Florida side, but he follows them out to Indian country. Yes, it's called The Community of Angola. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I'm not seeing any more hands. Oh,
I see one
Brandon,
person
you
just said I
got
have
one more?
I'm here, I'm good.
Oh, there's one more from
Are there
Sarah.
traditional games or sports? Man, that's a good one. So yes, the oldest game that they play is called ball game. And it is a game that is played from basically New York down to South Florida out west. In some versions, it looks really similar to lacrosse. In other versions, the Florida version, though, rather than having two goals, whatever, 100 yards apart, they have one pole. On the top of the pole is a basket. Often an eagle is placed on the top of the basket, and they play men against women rather than village against village. But that's a game that they've been playing for a very long time. Men would have what we would call, looks like a lacrosse stick. Women were allowed to use their hands. But they've been playing that for a very, very long time. In the 1800s, when they started getting involved in the cattle industry, they played all sorts of games with what amounts to, say, the knuckles of cow bones. I don't understand the intricacies of it, but basically they used them as the equivalent of dice. And I know still some Seminole cowboys that still play today. So those are the two that I know of both, but ball game, the Choctaw word for ball game is toli, which is little brother of war. And it's a game that they would play against rival communities as a proxy for diplomacy or a proxy for war. There's some really amazing portraits of it, paintings of it, and kind of descriptions, but it's all over the place. And Seminoles played that, but as they became more separated from other communities, they stopped playing against other communities. They played against themselves, men against women. So Osceola died at Fort Moultrie. When was his body or remains brought back, from what we know, to Florida? I want to say it was 40 years ago. It's been a while now. There's still a headstone or whatever, a marker in South Carolina. And to my knowledge, there's no marker in Florida. I've never seen it. Anyone have another question? I'm trying to navigate this thing.
I don't want to speak too soon again.
That's right.
There has been a documentary, or not a documentary, well, yeah, it's basically a documentary on PBS recently, about Florida, and they were interviewing a descendant of Osceola's on one of the reservations. Oh, there's Brandon again.
What led me to become a scholar of the history of the Seminoles? I mean, that's a good question. That's, truthfully, it's not the best answer, but I'm going to give you the honest one. So I went to graduate school at the University of Florida because I was really interested in the origins of the American South. And when I thought about that as an undergrad, and for maybe my first couple years of graduate school, it really didn't, the presence of Native people was not part of that conversation. I was interested in notions of violence and honor because that's what my advisor did. And I found myself working on a project in 1600s Virginia. And I knew I was going to do something on Bacon's Rebellion, and there was a really good book on Bacon's Rebellion, and there was an Indian part to the book. And so I thought I would take an anthropology class because there was no one in the history department that did anything that was Native American history. And I found myself there enjoying an anthropology class on the Indians of the Southeast. At the same time, I went to Virginia to do some research on my master's project. And I found a really wonderful scholar and now a friend who was working on what I thought would be my project. And he was 4 years ahead of me. I was basically just about done with his dissertation at Syracuse. And I came home, I told my advisor, he said, oh, we'll figure something out. And I told my anthropologist professor, and he gave me this oral story about white indentured servants being adopted by the Creeks and having kids and taking the Trail of Tears and going out to Indian country. And I wrote a paper for a class on that, and I kind of fell in love with a whole series of questions that opened up. And so I wrote my dissertation, my first book, and a bunch of articles on Creeks, and found in Georgia, North Florida, and Alabama, kind of ignored everything that was Seminole because it wasn't part of the book, and found myself with a job at Florida Atlantic University, having just replaced a scholar who wrote like 8 books on the Seminoles, and there was a really good library for it, and the Seminoles were around the corner. It just made sense for me to turn in that direction as I moved forward. Now, stupidly, I thought if I knew everything about Creeks, or at least I thought I did, going to Seminole country would be easy because they're supposed to be the same, and man, they're really different people. So it's been a real learning curve, but it's been fun.
Well, one more. No, he said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Well, I say thank you too. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. I really appreciate you coming tonight. Oh, maybe there's a Q&A. Oh no, Charlene, thank you so much again. I appreciate it. I think all of our participants and attendees appreciate it. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Like I said, I grew up in Comanche country, so Seminoles are completely new to me. And any more questions? Awesome. Nope. Thank you from Michelle. And we're here every week, Thursday. So all of you who want to come back next week, we will be here. We'll be sending out an e-blast early in the week. And if anybody has any questions, you can reach me at the email provided or contact the museum, and they'll always get a hold of me. So everybody, we will see you next week, and have a great one.
Thank you.
All right. Be safe.
Thanks everyone for coming.